Deep in the Utah desert lies a ranch, surrounded by some of the strangest stories in modern America. People have reported mysterious lights appearing over the property, objects moving through the sky, unexplained animal deaths, and events they say they could not explain. For decades, investigators have tried to find out what is really happening here. Some believe the answer involves UFOs. Others blame unusual environmental phenomena. To understand the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch, we have to start with the place itself. The property lies in Utah's Uinta Basin, a remote region surrounded by mountains, dry grassland, and enormous stretches of open wilderness. It is far from the noise of major cities, and that isolation has always been part of its character. From the outside, the ranch looks ordinary. Fences divide the land, dirt roads cross the property, buildings sit beneath the enormous Utah sky. There is nothing about the landscape that immediately suggests anything unusual. And yet, according to people who have lived and worked there, strange incidents began turning this ordinary ranch into one of the most talked about mysterious locations in America. But the ranch became famous for something that cannot be seen from a map. During the 1990s, a family living on the property began reporting a series of strange incidents. According to their accounts, unusual lights appeared in the sky. Objects seemed to move in ways they could not identify, and some events appeared to happen around the ranch itself. Then came the stories involving livestock. Animals were reportedly found dead or injured under circumstances that witnesses considered unusual. For the people experiencing these events, the incidents were not distant rumors. They were happening around their own property. And the more stories accumulated, the harder it became to dismiss the ranch as simply another remote piece of Utah farmland. But there was a problem. Most of these early accounts depended heavily on eyewitness testimony. And eyewitnesses can be sincere while still being wrong about what they saw. A light in the night can appear impossible when there is no reference point. So the question became more complicated. Were people witnessing something genuinely unexplained, or were ordinary events being transformed into extraordinary stories? That question would eventually attract investigators to the ranch. But before investigators, cameras, and scientific equipment became part of the story, there was another mystery surrounding the ranch, its name. The word Skinwalker comes from Navajo cultural traditions, where it refers to a figure associated with harmful supernatural practices. But there is an important distinction. The modern legend surrounding Skinwalker Ranch should not be treated as a direct representation of Navajo beliefs or traditions. Over time, the name became attached to the ranch. That connection helped transform an isolated piece of Utah farmland into something much larger, a legend. Stories of strange creatures, mysterious lights, unusual encounters, and unexplained events began circulating. And as the story spread, something interesting happened. The legend began influencing the way people interpreted what happened at the ranch. If someone saw a strange light, it was no longer simply a strange light. How do you separate what actually happened from the story people already expect to find? And that was the challenge facing the investigators who came next. They weren't simply walking onto a mysterious ranch. Now, they wanted to know if the evidence could tell a different story. Researchers were brought in to study the ranch and document what was happening there. Cameras were installed. Sensors were placed around the property. Investigators began monitoring the skies, the ground, and the ranch buildings. The goal was simple. If something unusual happened, they wanted to record it. But investigating a mystery is very different from telling a mystery. A witness can describe something strange. A sensor can produce an unusual reading. But none of those things automatically tells you what caused the event. And this is where Skinwalker Ranch became especially interesting. Once the cameras started rolling, the mystery was no longer based only on eyewitness stories. Now, investigators had something they could measure. And some of the strangest reports came from above. For years, Some of the strangest reports from the ranch came from the sky. Witnesses described lights appearing over the mountains. Sometimes the lights seemed stationary. Other times they appeared to move. And that raised an obvious question. Were these objects actually unusual? Or were ordinary objects being misunderstood in the darkness? Investigators knew that the night sky could be deceptive. Distance could be difficult to judge. Atmospheric conditions could distort what people saw. But some observations were considered unusual enough to investigate. Cameras watched the sky. Sensors recorded the environment. And investigators waited for something they could actually document. Because seeing something strange is one thing, proving what it was is another. But the sky wasn't the only source of strange reports. Some of the most disturbing stories happened much closer to the ground. They involved the animals living on the ranch. And those reports would become some of the ranch's most controversial stories. Some of the most disturbing stories from Skinwalker Ranch involved livestock. Animals were reportedly found dead under circumstances witnesses considered unusual. In some accounts, the injuries appeared difficult to explain. That immediately raised suspicions. Was there a predator? Was there an environmental cause? Or was something else happening? The problem was that unusual does not automatically mean unexplained. A remote ranch can attract predators that are rarely seen. Weather, disease, terrain, and other natural factors can also create strange-looking evidence. And without complete forensic evidence, certainty becomes difficult. But for the people living there, the incidents were still deeply unsettling. And the animal stories added another layer to a mystery that was already growing. But the ranch was no longer attracting only curious observers. Interest was beginning to reach far beyond the property. And eventually, the story gained a government connection. That changed the mystery completely. The government connection made the Skinwalker Ranch story even more controversial. But the real story was more complicated than the rumors suggested. In the late 2000s, reports of unusual aerial phenomena were attracting renewed attention. Military and intelligence communities wanted to understand what some of these sightings actually represented. One program became publicly known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The program examined reports of unusual aerial phenomena and potential aerospace threats. That connection helped fuel speculation that Skinwalker Ranch itself had attracted government interest. But speculation is not the same thing as proof. There is no simple government document proving that officials discovered something supernatural at the ranch. What is documented is a broader government interest in unexplained aerial phenomena. And that distinction matters, because the existence of an investigation does not automatically explain what investigators found. And at Skinwalker Ranch, the question remained exactly where it had started. What was actually happening there? By now, the ranch had become more than a collection of old stories. It had become an active laboratory, and the technology was becoming far more sophisticated. Now investigators could watch the ranch in ways earlier researchers never could. The modern investigation changed the way the ranch was studied. Researchers were no longer relying only on eyewitness accounts. They had cameras watching the property around the clock. Thermal cameras could see what ordinary eyes could not. Sensors monitored the air, the ground, and the electromagnetic environment. Every unusual event could now be compared with measurable data. And that created a much harder standard for extraordinary claims. A strange light wasn't enough. Investigators needed to know exactly what produced it. The same principle applied to every unexplained reading. Was the measurement real? Could the equipment have malfunctioned? Could the environment explain it? Or was there genuinely something unusual happening? The technology could collect more data than ever before, but data doesn't always provide an answer. And that is where the real mystery begins. Because some observations remained difficult to explain, and some became the most famous claims associated with the ranch. But what happens when an investigation produces evidence that is strange? yet still incomplete. Over the years, Skinwalker Ranch became associated with claims far stranger than lights in the sky. Witnesses reported objects moving through the sky. Others described strange sounds coming from seemingly empty areas. There were also reports of unusual disturbances around the property. Some stories even involve strange objects appearing and disappearing. But stories become complicated when they are difficult to reproduce. A single unexplained event can be fascinating, but repeating that event under controlled conditions is much harder. That distinction separates an observation from a scientific explanation. And Skinwalker Ranch has produced plenty of observations. The difficult question is what those observations actually mean. Is there a single phenomenon connecting all of these reports? Or are completely different events being grouped together? That is the problem at the heart of the Skinwalker mystery. The evidence can be strange, without telling us exactly what caused it. And that leaves us with the biggest question. What if the mystery isn't one mystery at all? What if several ordinary explanations are hiding beneath extraordinary stories? To answer that, investigators have to separate the legend from the evidence. After decades of stories, one question becomes unavoidable. How much of Skinwalker Ranch can actually be proven? The first problem is that much of the ranch's history comes from eyewitness accounts. Witnesses can honestly report what they experienced. But memory, distance, lighting, and expectation can affect what people remember. That is why investigators look for something more than testimony. They look for independent measurements. They look for recordings that can be checked. And most importantly, they look for results that can be repeated. That is where the mystery becomes much harder. An unexplained observation is not automatically evidence of something supernatural. It simply means that at that moment, investigators did not have a complete explanation. And that distinction is often lost when the story reaches the public. A strange report becomes a mystery. The mystery becomes a legend. And eventually, the legend can become bigger than the evidence itself. So, after all these years, what can we actually say about Skinwalker Ranch? There are reports. There are investigations. And there are still questions.